Hello and welcome to the Tennessee Informer. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I think we all know our government lies to us. And more we find out that this is not just a recent development. And they don't just lie about current events, but they lie about history as well. And it's not just the government. It's academia, K through 12 and beyond. And of course, there's Hollywood and the lefty historians and even allegedly conservative historians and talk show hosts. One of the biggest lies they spread is about the American Civil War, especially about the causes, the South, slavery, secession, and even Lincoln himself. Now, I have had several guests on this show that are very well versed on the truth of the war and very informative. Most have been from the South, making it appear that their views may have been slanted. However, our guest tonight is not only not from the South, but comes from the far, far north, deep in the heart of Yankee land, Vermont. But what makes him even more interesting is despite all the propaganda he grew up with about the Union and Lincoln being the good guys fighting to end slavery, in the South with the Confederacy being traitorous slave drivers, he did his own research and found out the real truth. He's put that truth into print in a book called Defending Dixie's Land, What Every American Should Know About the South and the Civil War. That man is author Jeb Smith, and he'll be here in just a few minutes. But first, it's time for the Informer Report. Texas takes a stand. Governor Abbott declared the Muslim Brotherhood and CAIR as foreign terrorist organizations. This will allow more enforcement against them and prevents them from buying land in Texas. That's probably should have happened several years ago, but better late than never. The Trump administration is reportedly going to do the same thing for the MB, and I'm assuming CAIR. But I have to ask, even though that is definitely needed, something the federal government needs to do, should have done decades ago, how's that going to work out with him playing footsies with Qatar? How is that going to work out with him having Qatar invest trillions in our economy? So I'm glad that it's going to happen, or appears that it's going to happen. I'm just not sure if he understands what the jihadist threat really is, or the level, or exactly who is a jihadist. I don't think he understands it. I don't think he has anybody around him who understands it. Qatar has been one of the leading funders of Islamic terrorism worldwide for decades. So we'll have to see how that works out. Trump is defending Madami from the claim that he is a jihadi that was made by Stefanik, who is running for governor of New York. Once again, I don't think he recognizes the doctrine of Islam. I don't think he understands how dangerous that doctrine is. Madami is not only a communist, he is an Islamist. And for a long time, I thought those two couldn't go together, until I did a little research, and oh, by the way, until I went to Iraq and I saw all these communist headquarters all throughout the country. I mean, they mesh very well together. And it seemed to me that his recent meeting with Mandami was just, they were entirely too cozy. I mean, it seems to me like he just, he was more comfortable with Mandami than he is with Massey, or currently with Marjorie Taylor Greene. And he made some comments that you really have to wonder. He said that they have a lot in common, and he's optimistic that he'll do well, and he wants him to do well. Is that, knowing that Mandami is a socialist and wants to spread socialism, and no doubt Islam, did the president just endorse socialism? We're going to have to watch. I think I think that we have maybe headed down a very, very bad road, and hopefully somebody will wake him up. Now, Frank Gaffney of the Security Policy Center, he did a very accurate assessment of Trump. It was in the Gateway Pundit this week, and he mentioned the fact that Trump is a non-ideological president. He's a post-ideological president. Of course, Reagan, for instance, was not only pro-America, but pro the American system, pro-capitalism, pro the Constitution, supported those type of things, and he was opposed to communism and socialism. Trump seems to think everything is the art of the deal. And just because he's not ideological doesn't mean people in Qatar are not ideological, people in Iran are not ideological, or the Chinese are not ideological. So it's concerning that he seems to think everything is just a business deal. And I wish he were a little more ideological, but I encourage you to read that. It's by Frank Gaffney in Gateway Pundit, I believe, yesterday. Why is a pro-Islamic group listed on the state website in Tennessee? The American Muslim Advisory Council is listed on our state website as a group that our state interfaces with. I got a problem with that. And here's the thing. People who have followed this in Tennessee for years, they know what that group is about. And we tried to warn the current governor, Lee, about that organization. Right before he was inaugurated in 2019, he had a photo taken with them. He met with them a couple of different times. And he just seemed to blow off any concerns. So I guess we know that he's comfortable with them because apparently, if they're on the state website, who knows how long they've been doing whatever with our state. But that's something else to be concerned about. I'm sure if there was an American Christian Association or Advisory Council, I'm sure people would be up in arms about that. Democrats are begging the military to disobey illegal orders without identifying what orders are illegal. Now, on one hand, this is, 98% of what our federal government does is illegal because it's unconstitutional. But for these Democrats, who we know they don't care anything about the Constitution, it's kind of like, and really neither party really cares about the Constitution. It's like Calhoun said back in the 1840s, the party out of power, they care about the Constitution, but once they're in power, they don't care. They just use it as a tool to beat the other side over the head with. But I think this is pretty dangerous for these elected officials, these elected Democrats, to make a statement, a vague statement, and encourage our military and our intelligence, hey, don't disobey, or excuse me, basically that you need to disobey any illegal orders. Well, if they have proof that Trump is issuing illegal orders, then they should be the ones doing something about it. If illegal orders have been issued, then it's on them to impeach him. It's not on them to encourage mutiny. It's not on them to encourage these guys to decide. And that's another problem too. Or there's another thing that they've left out. And they're actually trying to use this as an excuse now. In the military, we are already trained to not obey illegal orders. Now, especially if you deploy overseas, you're going to get all these briefings on not obeying illegal orders, okay? That's not a defense. You cannot say, I'm just following orders. But for these elected officials to just vaguely out there and say, hey, disobey any illegal orders from Trump without specifying what those illegal orders are, that's dangerous. And Mark Kelly, who is retired military, I think he was a captain in the Navy, which that's an 06. That's pretty high up the food chain. And they're talking about actually bringing him back in and possibly facing a court-martial. And he should, because he knows better than this. Like I said, if these guys think that Trump is doing something illegal, then they have the remedy. But to try to encourage a bunch of people that are in the military to, put themselves in that position, that's dangerous. That is dangerous. They are trying to undermine the military. Now, I'm not saying there aren't legitimate concerns about some of the things going on, okay? Especially when it comes to Venezuela. I think there's a whole lot more to that situation than we're being told. But if they have proof, it's on them to do something, Congress, not encourage the military to mutiny. And I hope that they're held accountable for that. Trump calls it sedition. If so, what is the punishment? Well, that's under 18C, the federal code, and it depends. If it's wartime, pretty stiff. Even in peacetime, the punishment is pretty stiff. So this needs to be addressed. Morons for millionaires in the Tennessee GOP governor's race. So we have a lot of people in the state of Tennessee that when it comes to a statewide race, especially like the governor's race, they will say, look, if your guy doesn't have a certain X million number of dollars in the millions, then he or she is not a serious contender. And we shouldn't even report on him. There was a case recently, Steve Gill, who has a publication. He's been around for years. Most people know who he is. He did a report on Rose and Marcia, John Rose, Congressman, and Marcia Blackburn, who are running. And, of course, the third prominent candidate is Monty Fritz, who, honestly, I'm supporting him. I'm supporting Monty, just so everybody understands that. Now, Steve did mention Monty, but he mentioned him towards the end. He didn't show his picture. So if you just looked at it, you would think the article was just about those two. But he mentions Monty towards the end, and he said, well, we'll wait until January when the financial reports are out and see if he's a legitimate candidate. It should bother everybody in the state of Tennessee that you have to have a certain dollar sign for these arbitrary gatekeepers, to say, oh, well, he's a legitimate candidate. If he doesn't have that, he's not a legitimate candidate. So they're not only providing the timeline, but they're providing the number, which he didn't give a specific number, but I've heard different numbers, tossed around. Otherwise, they're not a legitimate candidate. So basically, if you can't buy this election, don't run. If you can't afford to buy the governor's spot in Tennessee, don't run. That's what the establishment hacks want us to believe. And I think it's disgusting, and I think people should take offense to that. Now, I understand if you don't have a lot of name recognition, like Marcia Blackburn, she's been up there forever, hasn't done anything in a long time. I think the most memorable thing she's done in recent history was stab Trump in the back. And of course, all of her speeches now are Trump, 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 trying to show how loyal she is to Trump. And she did vote for the bill recently that would allow her and others to sue over the Arctic Frost deal. But other than that, I can't think of too many things she's done in recent decades. But if you don't have millions of dollars, don't run. That's the message, and that's the wrong message. And people should take offense at that. And hey, money does need support. Yes, it does take money. But for these gatekeepers to arbitrarily set a timeline and amount, that's flat out wrong. That wraps up this installment on the Informer Report. If you have a news story that you want to alert us to, be sure to send us an email at tennesseeinformer.tv@gmail.com. Before we bring our next guest out, there is a message from our sponsor. We do have a sponsor now, and here it is. It's LiveWave. Live long, live well, live young.
Light, the energy of life itself. Since the beginning of time, light has sustained us, fueled our growth, and shaped the world. Even Einstein recognized that everything we are is made of light. But what if we could harness the light within us? Not just to live, but to renew, restore, and rejuvenate. Introducing LifeWave X39, the first product in the world that activates stem cells using our body's own light. Backed by clinical research, multiple patents, and over 10 years of stem cell research, a revolutionary wearable light technology that unlocks the power of activating our own stem cells with a single, safe, affordable, non-transdermal patch that puts you back in control of how you look, feel, and perform. Unlike drugs or chemicals, X39 works naturally, awakening your body's ability to heal and thrive. It's time to unlock your full potential, restore your vitality, and embrace a healthier, more vibrant you.
And now to our guest, Jeb Smith. Jeb is a lifelong Vermonter, an author and speaker whose books include Defending Dixie's Land, What Every American Should Know About the South and the Civil War, written under the pen name Isaac C. Bishop, and Defending the Middle Ages, Little Known Truths About the Crusades, Inquisitions, Medieval Women, and more. Smith has written over 130 articles found in several publications, among them the Libertarian Institute. History Now magazine, Abbeville Institute, the Postal magazine, the Libertarian Christian Institute, Practical Distribution, Rutland Herald, the Vermont Daily Chronicle, Medieval Archive, History Medieval, Medieval Magazine, Fellowship, and Fairy Dust Magazine, and has been featured on various podcasts and radio interviews. He also does speaking engagement, interviews, and questions, and we are glad to have him here. Thank you so much for being with us today. How are you?
Doing very well. Thank you for having me on.
Now, so before we talk about this book, this is not the only historical event or period you've written about. As I talked about in your bio, you usually cover earlier periods like the medieval period.
Right, yeah, I have a love both for the South, especially, and the Middle Ages, and I found a lot of similarities between the two culturally and politically, and I noticed that's what drew me to both of those time periods.
Okay, so that's one of the things that inspired you, is you saw a similarity, and or were there other things that inspired you to write this book specifically about the South?
It was, I mean, I've always been interested in the Civil War. It started out through military aspects. I always loved, that angle of the history. And it really came about when I started digging into the original sources. I came across a book, The South Was Right by the Kennedy brothers, and Myths of American Slavery. And when I read those, I said, there's a complete opposite of what I've been told my entire life. And I wasn't quite sure how to take it. And I said, I couldn't believe what I was being told, and I had to dig into the original sources and read more. And I researched for years. And when I discover something is not as I was taught, I want to share that with other people. I want to say, hey, we've not been given the full accurate history. I'm speaking to Vermonters. I really wrote the book for Vermonters and Northerners who grew up as I did, that were taught the same things that I was in school. And I want to say, hey, look, we've been misled about this whole deal with the Civil War, and to look at our history, that you go back 150 years or so, in that our history can be manipulated so drastically, is really surprising, and it really causes you to question everything else that you've been told, because here you are in a country, in America, supposedly we're free to learn, free to ask questions, but really the information we're given is it's been narrowed down, it's been selected, and it has an effect on you politically. We were talking about this before the show. Learning about the Civil War in the South and the Union and decentralization completely changed my political viewpoints, because I'd never been introduced to that sort of thought, that politics before, which I'd call as very decentralized, conservative, libertarian. I only knew the nationalist view. And so I was really into that, the nationalistic view, because that's all I knew. And so being introduced to what I'd say is the true history of antebellum America and the politics involved there completely changed my views. And I think it can change others as the information gets out there. But if it doesn't get out there, you can't change people's views, which is why I think it's so controlled, and they have that grip on us. And that's to have us accept our current situation of what I call authoritarian, tyrannical government that we live under today. That's really illegal and unconstitutional. And if people knew the true history of America and the South, they would see that as well, and then they wouldn't be so blindly obedient to the politicians of today.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, it's still relevant. This is not just a let's go back and fight another battle, because a lot of the liberal historians and even a lot of the so-called conservative historians, they love Lincoln. Well, Lincoln saved the Union. Well, no, Lincoln destroyed the republic that the founders gave us. That is what Lincoln did, was he destroyed it. And so, and even the lefties will call it this, a lot of them will call it the second American founding. Well, wait a minute. That implies that it's different from the original founding. Right. And it most definitely is different, and not in a good way. Right. Yes, it ended slavery, but we'll talk about that some more here in a minute. And now the book has a lot of details. I haven't read all of it yet. I've read a good bit of it. Tonight we're going to focus on three main areas. Slavery as described in the slave narratives, secession, and Lincoln. And those are, I think, probably three of the the most important areas. So do you want to start with the slave narratives, or you want to start with secession? Which one would you rather start with?
We could start with the slave narratives if you'd like.
Okay, so
Yeah, yeah.
go ahead. I know everybody has this idea of slavery,
Mhm.
and this is what we're going to say is not to say condone it or bring it back, but to give a more accurate picture of what slavery was.
As I say in my book, we can still condemn slavery, but we don't have to lie about it to exaggerate the evils. We can tell the truth about it. And I think that actually, as I say in my book, part of what I want to do about in my chapter on slavery is actually unite us, because today politicians and education, they use slavery as a way of dividing black versus white. And they say, we were at war with each other. You should hate these people over here. And they did all these evil things. But if you look at the true history of slavery, you see it was more, like family and friends almost in many of these ways. And there was great relationships that existed in these adverse conditions of slavery. And one of the sources that you mentioned that we want to talk about that I loved is the slave narratives. And so it's available online, the Library of Congress, Born in Slavery, and they have it divided in states. And you can just go through an entire state. There are thousands of interviews with slaves or former slaves or family members. Sometimes it's sons and daughters because the slaves had passed. There's a few decades later. And they interviewed him and they asked him what slavery was like. And in there, you can find both the good and the bad. And that's what I really like about it. You can find the extremes and everything in between. And if you look at the entirety of the slave narratives, it shouldn't be your only source learning about slavery, but it is a great source to hear firsthand accounts from slaves themselves. But you'll find that what we've done with history, we've taken the worst 10% of slavery, of the slave experience, and we pretended that's what slavery was like everywhere, and that's not the case at all. That was actually a very minimal number of cases and circumstances that what we think of as slavery that actually existed. And by far, there's a lot of slaves that talk about their masters as their best friends and how they love them and all these things they did for them. And masters and slaves going fishing together, going hunting together, teaching them to read, giving them gifts. They're treated as friends and extended family. I mean, these are generally devout Christians compared to our world today, and they're living with these people. They're not, they're not evil and whipping them and doing all these things. Those are very rare cases. And also the states, I go through some of the states' Confederate constitutions, and in there they say, you have to treat your slaves well, you have to feed them, you can't use excessive abuse and all these sorts of things. And many slaves in the slave narratives, when they talk about when slavery ended, that was actually a very sad day for them. Many of them cried because they were kicked off of what they knew their family. They live in this local community of their friends and family, really on a plantation. And now they're kind of shipped out on their own without land, without money, without care. A lot of the older slaves said, I really wish we were back in those days because I didn't have to worry about food. I didn't have to worry about money, about medical care. All these things were taken care of. All I had to do is go work. And then at nighttime, we danced, we drank, it was basically a party every night. So they really, in many cases, I'd say they really had a relaxed, leisurely life without a lot of stress, without a lot of worry. Most slaves barely even interacted with their master. Their master often lived off-site. He may have had multiple plantations, or he was in the big house and they were kind of in their own village there. And he's kind of more of a manager, a corporate boss who comes by once in a while to see if there's a problem or fix something up. And it's not the way it's portrayed in movies and things.
Right. And the thing to remember too, when the country was founded, there was slavery in each state or each colony. So at the time of the Declaration of Independence, at the time of the Constitution, it was a slaveholding republic, okay, North and South. Now, the North did end slavery sooner in most cases than the South, obviously. But it's not like they necessarily freed all their slaves. And in a lot of cases, they sold their slaves down south. So they ended slavery in their state. But it's not like they just said, hey, you're free to go. And I'm sure some of them did, but because they really were not that welcome in the North in many places.
Right.
And we can talk about that some, but They sold them down south, and even during the Civil War. I can't. I got to give Brian McClanahan credit for this because this is where I heard it. It was two slave-holding republics fighting,
Right.
because even states in the North had slaves. Kentucky never left the Union. They had slaves. Delaware never left the Union. They had slaves. Maryland would have left the Union, but they definitely had slaves. And so you had a lot of, and in fact, I think some of the Union generals actually owned slaves.
Right. Yeah. And I always think of George Thomas, who was a Virginian, who was a slave owner, who went and fought for the North. Supposedly he's a Southern general and he's a slave owner. And this war is about slavery. Why did he fight for the North? But Thomas D. Lorenzo, who I'm sure you're familiar with, in The Real Lincoln, it may have been Lincoln Unmasked, he points out in every major battle, you had Northern slave-owning soldiers fighting against Southerners who didn't own slaves. The majority of the Confederate soldiers did not own slaves. The majority of the South were not slave-owning. And yeah, slavery's throughout the Union for sure. And actually, in my book, in one of the chapters, I go through how the majority of the abolitionist groups were in the South, actually around 70% up until around 1850, I believe. And then you get the somewhat the radical abolitionists that want to end slavery immediately, and they'll do it by violent ends, like John Brown.
Yep.
And they start really intruding politically on the South and demonizing the South. And you get a resistance in the decade or 2 decades leading up to the Civil War of the South. That's a pushback from the abolitionist movement. And you start to get some of the Southerners saying, look, slavery is this great economic system. We've elevated blacks because in Africa they had horrible lives. It's dreadful over there. And so slavery is actually a positive good. God has brought these people to us to spread the gospel to them, to take care of them and improve their lives. And that's somewhat that pushback argument. But by and large, North and South, no one wanted slavery, I guess, or very few saw it as a positive good, but more as a necessary evil. I think it was Thomas Jefferson that said we had the wolf by the ears and we can't let it go. It's dangerous to let go, or how are you going to get rid of this? I quote Abraham Lincoln in 1858 in Illinois saying, when the South says they know not how to get rid of slavery, I fully understand because I don't know how to do it either. And we think, oh, of course, you just emancipate them, let them all go. Well, hundreds of thousands of them died very soon after the war due to sickness and starvation things, because we did pretty much just let them go. The government said, we're going to give you your land and your mule. But of course, the government never fulfills what it promises. And at the same time, race relations were destroyed the way we ended emancipation.
Right.
And you look at the South, already individuals were freeing slaves in large numbers. Virginia had, I think it was 250,000 free blacks in 1860. Louisiana, New Orleans, which is is the largest city in the South, a quarter of their population was free blacks. And so, it was happening, just not at the federal level, and it wasn't immediate. And so we would have lost out the benefits of ending slavery quickly, but you also avoided the negatives of the way we did it. And I'm not saying that we should have continued slavery. I'm just saying there's justification to why Lincoln and many in the North and many in the South said you can't just emancipate everyone immediately. It's going to destroy both North and South, or white and black in the South.
But at the end of the war, or towards the end of the war, I know there was a conversation between him and Alexander Stephens, and Stephens brought these issues up. Hey, look, a lot of these guys are just field hands. We don't have land to give them. The South, of course, was economically devastated. And he's like, well, if we just release them all, what's going to happen to them? And he was showing concern for the slaves. And Lincoln's response was, root hog or die.
Right.
Now, that's not somebody that really cares about the slaves that they're freeing. And let's not forget that Lincoln, he was all about shipping them back throughout his time. And matter of fact, until he died, he was all about shipping them back.
Right. Yeah. And I think it was R.L. Dabney that wrote for the New York Times, I believe, the largest northern newspaper. And it was a few within the decade after the war. And he said, supposedly this war, the North cares about the black man and they're going to take care of him. He said, here's where they were when we were their masters taking care of them. Here they are now. And he's showing that the South cared more for the material and the life of the black than the North supposedly that claimed they did. They really just, they didn't take care of them
Right.
in comparison to the way the South did. Even though they were legally slaves, they were still, their care was considered through state laws and through the masters and through society as well.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we struggle to grasp today is, if it's a slave, then you must abuse them. You must not care about them. And that's not the case at all. You can love your slave. They can be a family member to you, even though they're legally owned by you.
Right. Well, and the other thing too is that like you say, they did have laws that protected. I mean, I've actually read accounts of where slaves went to trial against their master or against other whites, and they did actually win sometimes. And the slaves were an investment. I mean, so, if you're brutal to your investment, you're not going to get much of a return.
And I used from the slave narratives to go back to them. There's a couple slaves that I quoted that weren't particularly taken care of, didn't have good masters, but they said we were well fed because master knew if we weren't well fed, we couldn't work. So just simple, interest of the master. He wants his slaves well fed, medical care. You can't afford to just have slaves dying or not well fed. You're not gonna get the return on your money in any way. So that's just simply, that was a common feature just for that reason alone.
And you mentioned the slave narratives. Now those were done in the 30s, right? 20s, 30s,
20s and 30s.
Yeah,
20s and 30s.
And so some of them would have been slaves as young children, and then most of them probably would have been the children of slaves, but they would have heard all the stories.
Right.
Good, bad, or ugly, they would have heard all the stories growing up.
And and that's why I really recommend reading a large segment of them, because a lot of them will be children telling the stories. This is what my mother told me. And some will say, I just don't know. I don't remember enough, too old. But there's quite a few that, they lived into adulthood and they lived a long time afterwards, and that they could recollect their events of growing up through adulthood into when the interviews occurred. Some of them happened in the teens as well, I believe. But yeah, a lot of them could be secondhand stories, but you'll get enough firsthand accounts of survivors that lived into their 20s and adulthood as well.
Right. Now we always hear the whole story is, hey, the North and South, they went to war over slavery, and the great northern states went in there and freed the slaves, and all that this was all about slavery, but it was really not all about slavery. So let's talk about some of the reasons for secession and the fact that secession was certainly not just a Southern view.
Right. Yeah. There, D. Lorenzo and Tom Woods have some great books on that. Secession was a Northern thing in New England as well, especially because leading up to the Civil War, the Virginians were dominating politics. Thomas Jefferson, Madison, George Washington. And so the North wasn't really having its way. And so it was more common in the North to nullify federal ruling and or talk about secession because they weren't in control of politics. And that switch by the time, due to immigration especially, that switch in 1860 where the North started to have control, and then you see the South start talking about secession. So it's a Northern and Southern thing. It's not like questionable legality. It's something that's ingrained in the Declaration of Independence and going back to the Middle Ages and Christian thought. So the thought is that if you're a communist, you're free if you live in a communist country because you have the politics you want. It may be authoritarian, but you have the right to live how you want. That's your choice. You're free. The libertarian today or conservative living in our modern state is not free because he doesn't have the government he desires. And so what the founding fathers did, and this again goes back to the Middle Ages, was they sought decentralization. Yep. So Mississippi can have its own laws and live the way it wants to. Vermont can live completely different, but we're not going to centralize that power where now it's a struggle and a fight for political control. And we're going to allow everyone to live and let live attitude. The central government really was delivered mail and dealt with international issues in between the states. It didn't regulate from the center as it does today, where everyone has to follow federal ruling. And so looking at the upper South especially, that's where I think it is the most ignored, is because whatever the reasons the cotton states left for, and we can talk about that, the upper South did not leave for those reasons. They stayed loyal to the Union by overwhelming majorities. Tennessee did.
Yep.
They voted 4-1 in favor of staying in the Union. They didn't want to join the cotton states. They didn't want to secede. They were against it until Lincoln's call for volunteers. And we don't realize what a big deal. I have a quote here from Governor Ishmael Harris of Tennessee. And so there's at the assembly in the state of Virginia on Thursday, the 25th of April. He said, talking about the Union, he said, if ever thus restored, it must by its very act cease to be a union of free and independent states, such as our fathers established. It will become a consolidated, centralized government without liberty or equality, in which some will reign and others few will tyrannize and many will suffer. It will be the greatest folly to hope for the reconstruction of a peaceful union. The federal union of states, thus practically dissolved, can never be restored. So the way the South viewed the Union at this time, which is the dominant view, both North and the South, is that all these states gathered out of free will and consent. Right. They were independent, they were sovereign, they joined a union for their own benefit.
Yeah. They delegated certain powers and retained everything else.
Right. And it's only what's specifically delegated by the states to the federal that they're allowed to do, and they can retain those rights if the federal abuses it, which includes secession and nullification. And so, in the whole idea, it's built on consent on the governed. So, if Mississippi feels that they're no longer want to be part of the union, want to do their own thing, well, that's their inalienable right to do that. If you have this central government that's telling the states and the people what to do, you've now flipped the whole understanding of the Constitution, the whole understanding of the union. The people are no longer in control of our government. Our government now is a military dictatorship that says you are forced to stay under our rule and our central authority, which is going to be controlled by these national parties and by the majority instead of we the people. So self-rule, self-government is completely abolished. And that's why R.L. Dabney said, when he was talking about Virginia, he said, no matter how wrongfully a state leaves the Union, so let's say the cotton states left for slavery, he said it doesn't matter. Force, you cannot use force. It's only reconciliation and consent to bring them back in the Union. They have the right to leave. And if you try to invade them, you're violating, Christian principles. You're violating liberty. And just to quote Tennessee, because you're from Tennessee, so the Tennessee Governor Harris again, he said, "Force, when attempted, changes the whole character of the government. The people of Tennessee has fully understood this important fact, and hence their anxiety to stay the hand of coercion. They well know that the subjugation of the seceding states, that's the cotton states, involves their own destruction. If they go along with Lincoln in subduing these cotton states, their state and all the northern states are also subdued. Everyone is now under the authority of the national government, and that is not the way that antebellum viewed the government up until this radical revolutionary Republican Party under Lincoln. And so it completely flipped the whole nation, the whole understanding of the Union, and that's what caused the Upper South to leave the Union. They wanted to be in the Union until Lincoln's call for volunteers that would completely transform our republic and our union into a nation. And that's why there's a newspaper I quote in North Carolina. It says the only republic now existing in America is the Confederacy. And so we have to go with the Confederacy. We can't join some military despotism under this tyrant Lincoln, who's already destroyed America. There's no going back. Once he calls for volunteers, the United States, as it was by the founders, was destroyed by that call for volunteers. And that's why the Upper South said, we're joining the Cotton States.
So,
the Confederacy.
And this was, of course, all after Sumter. Now, a lot of people say, well, Sumter was the justification, and they got them to fire the first shot. So it's all, but keeping in the views with that time, if that was such an issue, the fact that they should have just dealt with South Carolina. I mean, they called up 75,000 troops. At the time, you only had about 13,000 troops in the whole army, and most of them were out west. So once they called up 75,000, like you said, the other states realized what was going to happen and what they would have to go along with in order
Right.
to follow that order. And can you imagine how different the Civil War would have been had Lincoln not provoked them at Sumter? Because Lincoln was told, he was told by his
Right.
own people, if you do this, this
You're
will
not
start. And he got the war he wanted. He got the fight that he picked. Now, he
right.
didn't think it was going to be 4 long years. He didn't think they were going to have mass casualties. He didn't
Right.
believe that. And the people on the South, a lot of them thought it would be short and sweet too. Both of them were wrong about that. But can you imagine a Civil War that didn't, if Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and to a lesser degree Arkansas, if they had not been part of the Confederacy, I mean, we would not have had because look how many troops those states provided. Look at the leadership those states provided. The troops and the
industrial
leadership that those states
production.
provided are huge. It would have been a whole different ballgame. But Lincoln had to have his war. And I think he didn't believe it would be long. He thought it'd be short and sweet. And once again, let's talk about some of the things that Lincoln said, because this whole narrative about slavery, Lincoln never said those things. I mean, he tries to play the part of the great emancipator later, or actually people try to paint him as the
Right.
great emancipator. But talk about some of the things Lincoln said about slavery prior to the war.
Well, he said multiple times that he'd never interfere with slavery in the states that already existed. He said, I have no legal right to do so, and I have no desire to do so. What he wanted to do was prevent slavery from expanding into the Western territories because, as he and the Republicans were open about, they want it for free white people. They didn't want blacks coming into their state. Many of the northern states wouldn't allow blacks into their state. They had laws against that, and they were more anti-slavery. I believe the most prominent reason is to keep blacks away because they wanted to stay segregated. Lincoln wanted to he wanted to slowly free the blacks. He consistently fought against the abolitionists during the war and the people who wanted to full scale end slavery on a large scale. He wanted to slowly do it in increments so that you could then deport them back to Africa or colonize them in Central America as he tried, or all black state. But he didn't want them free running around, as across America, voting and participating in equality in America. He had no intention to do that. But yeah, he had no, in the Republican planks as well, said, we're not touching slavery. We don't have constitutional right to do so in the states. They offered, and Lincoln endorsed, as DiLorenzo points out in his inaugural address, Lincoln endorsed the Corwin Amendment, which would have enshrined slavery in our Constitution, which would have made it illegal to abolish it. And so, especially if you're saying the states left for slavery, they had all the protection they needed. And this was pointed out by Lincoln. You can have it permanently enshrined in the states where you have slavery already, and it can never be touched. And that was given as an offer to the cotton states. And as well, they had the runaway slaves could be returned. And Lincoln said, if you guys leave, you're not going to have the protection of your runaway property anymore because you're no longer part of the United States. Slavery would never have been more protected had the cotton states stayed in the Union in 1860. And Lincoln had no intentions of ending slavery in those states.
Yeah. And the Emancipation Proclamation was a crock. It didn't apply. It only applied to the states where the federal government had no authority to enforce it, and it did not apply into the areas under Union control where they had slaves. So, like, they exempted Louisiana. It certainly didn't apply to Kentucky and other slave states. It just applied to the places, the Confederacy. The Confederate states not under federal control yet. So there's no way to enforce that, and all that was basically trying to do was to encourage the slaves to leave the plantation and hopefully do an uprising on their part.
That was definitely a military operation. And Lerone Bennett Jr. has a great book, Forced into Glory, Abraham Lincoln's White Dream. And he goes through and shows how Lincoln tried not to do it. He was forced by the states, by governors of Massachusetts, and that wanted to withhold support from the North because the North was not doing well at this point in the war. And they're saying something has to happen. You have to go after slavery because slavery is this huge benefit for the South because the slaves can do all the work for their white population so that they can go to war, and it's maximizing food production in the military capacity of the South. They said we need to hit them here, hit them at slavery, and now weaken the war effort, and that was the main thing. But Lincoln the whole time said, that's forced into glory," is what Bennett Jr. says. He was pushed into it. He said, "I was reluctant to do it. I didn't want to do this. Circumstances have forced me into this situation of writing the Emancipation Proclamation." And Congress was going to pass, I believe it was called the Confiscation Act, that would have freed slaves permanently. It was actually a conservative reaction by Lincoln against the abolitionists. And Forced into Glory is a great book that I'd recommend to anyone, not only about Lincoln's white supremacist views, but his views on slavery and how he was forced into the Emancipation Proclamation. It was not his own doing. It was actually a conservative reaction to the radical abolitionists who really were using the war as an opportunity to get what they wanted to do, and also to hurt the South militarily.
Yeah. Well, as far as, you mentioned white supremacy. I mean, at that time, by today's standards, everybody north, south, east, west, all the whites were, by today's standards, a white supremacist. I mean, that's just the views were not really any different in the North than they were in the South, because even the abolitionists, they were against slavery and wanted them freed, but they wanted them freed down there. They don't want them up here. It's not like they had a welcome wagon ready to, okay, we're going to free you and bring you up here. That was not the plan. Right. We want you freed, but we want you to stay down there, and we definitely don't want you coming into the Western territory.
And Ken Burns' documentary, I'm sure you've heard of it or watched it, the Civil War documentary. Yeah. At the end of the documentary, it always stuck with me because he said Sherman shook the hands of a black man, and everyone was shocked and awed, like, wow, a white man, shook hands with a black man. And then in my book, I'll quote many observers from the North and from slaves and Southerners that stuff happened all the time in the South. They lived together, they worked together, they slept together. They, blacks would hold whites, they'd play together, they interacted. And so many observers from Europe say there's less racism. They'll treat them like, as one slave said, they'll treat you like they'll handle you like a slave, but they're not racist against you in color like they are in the North. Right. The North was very, segregationist. That segregation is the Northern thing. That's what they're all about, to keep the blacks in the South. And the South interacted with them. They were more warm. They were more welcome. I quote a lot of the former slaves who, many of them went North and said, slaves don't belong up there. They're not treated well. We're going back to the South. And so as far as a personal level, they were much more accepting. And I think it's just because they interacted. They lived together. And in the North, blacks were still foreign. They didn't see them that often, so you don't have that, they haven't broken through the barriers as they have in the South. So I would say that the South was far less racist, even if they were white supremacists in a view. It's not
by today's standards.
Yeah, and I think white supremacy has also taken on a new meaning since Hitler, and it's kind of that, evolutionist. They're less evolved, they're less worthy. And in the South, that's why I quote many slave owners and theologians saying blacks are equal with us before God. They're 100% human. They're divine nature. They're bone of our bone, flesh of our flesh. We are one and the same. And so they didn't view blacks as less than human, whereas I think white supremacy today has that view of whites are somehow naturally, genetically better, or something along those lines. And I think that's, that Hitler's sort of white supremacy that didn't exist at that time, at least in the South, as it does today. So it's a different form. It's what I think is a less repulsive, I guess would be the word, form of supremacy. It's more of a cultural thing. And if you saw what Africa was like in 1860, I quote many slaves saying, yeah, we'd much rather be slaves here in America to the white man than in Africa. And I don't know if there's anyone in the world that'd rather be a slave at that time in Africa. Right. I mean, they ate you. They did all these horrible things, those cannibal tribes. In their society and their culture, I would say America was far better. I wouldn't associate necessarily because it was established by whites and Africa's black, but I'm saying if you're going to pick one culture, I would much rather be a slave or a citizen in America at that time, regardless of race, than Africa. And so I think that's part of why that's sort of the white supremacist view that Americans had at that time, which I think differs than what we assume today.
Right. Now, I want to go back to the secession and nullification a little bit because I want to hit something on that. you mentioned nullification and secession, and by the way, those are two different things. There's a lot of people out there that don't know that. But those were things that were brought up in New England, as you mentioned, well before in the South. I mean, when we hear nullification, we think 1832, or that's what they tell us. 1832 South Carolina nullification attempt, and then the South for secession in 1860. But New England states were talking about secession in 1794. New England states were talking about secession in 1814. They actually used nullification during the Jefferson administration and during the Madison administration during the War of 1812.
And they would use the language that the South used, that the states are sovereign and authorities with the states, not the federal government. And they used the same language, the same perspective as the South did in 1860. And I had to recommend Tom Wood's Nullification.
Yep, excellent book.
Of the Government. I mean, that he'll go through plenty of examples, North and South, but the vast majority are in the North. And one thing I love is he quotes Wisconsin, where they nullified the
fugitive slave laws.
Because they're like, we don't, just because these southern states recognize slave property, we think that's against our Christian morals, and we're not going to do that here in our state. So we're nullifying the federal law. This is in 1859, 1860, around the same time, and we don't ever hear about, that northern, plenty in the North throughout agreed with that southern view. In fact, there's one quote that I love that I'd like to read if I could real quick. I missed it. It's Alexander Hamilton in the New York Ratification Convention, and this is more to do with the upper South causes of secession. So 1788, the New York Ratifying Convention is Alexander Hamilton, a Northern Federalist. He says, to coerce the states is the maddest project that was ever devised. A complying state at war with a non-complying state. Congress marching troops in one state into the bosom of another. Here is a nation at war with itself. Can any reasonable man well be disposed towards a government which makes war and carnage the only means of supporting itself? A government that can exist only by the sword. This single consideration should be sufficient to dispose of every peaceable citizen against such a government. So he's saying that fact alone, which is what happened when Lincoln called for volunteers, which is what caused the upper South to leave. He's saying in 1788 in New York that should cause everyone to go against such a government. So according to Alexander Hamilton, who's the Northern Federalist, if Lincoln had done what he did then, the whole nation should rebel against it and leave, just as the upper South did. And that's why I love James McPherson. I quote, he's a pro-North historian, well-respected. And he said, the South's ideas about Republican in the Union hadn't changed since the founders. Right. The North had. The South was what was normal before Lincoln. And after, it's the northern version that became normal. So the South didn't change. They were conservative. They were the same as the founders. It's the North that changed radically. And we blame the South and we look at them as, seceding, and that's a radical movement. But really, it's a conservative movement. Right. They're simply not going along with what the North is doing in their progressive movements towards modernity. They're simply staying the same. They're very conservative, and they had been all along. So they just simply didn't change, but it makes them, especially in the textbooks, look like the radicals, when really they didn't do anything. They stayed the same.
Right. Yeah, secession did not necessarily mean war. I mean, even though some people knew that that's what was going to happen, because they, Lincoln in his inaugural kind of hinted that, okay, well, really, if I don't get my tariff paid, then I'm coming your way. And I want to hit this real quick, though. Not only when the South left would they lose the tariff from the South, which they depended heavily on, the federal government needed that, but they would lose much more than just the tariff, because now you would have another country to your south with ports that didn't charge. So they would have lost a huge source of their income from Europe, because Europe would have traded almost exclusively with the South. So in terms of the actual cause of the war, not only was slavery not the cause of the war, but it's what they always say, follow the money. I believe, that's my personal belief, is that's why Lincoln went to war was over the loss of the money that they were going to lose. I mean, bottom line, they were going to lose that money, and the Union would have been ruined, and so that's why he went to war. But here's the thing: Lincoln destroyed the Founders Republic. So we hear all these people that they lavish all this praise on Lincoln, but he destroyed the republic that the founders gave us. He didn't restore it. He didn't maintain it. He destroyed it. And he changed the nature of the republic. It's no longer voluntary. And if you leave, you will be attacked and destroyed. That's huge. I think there's only a couple of things that have probably been worse than that. But if he had not done that, these other things would not have happened. And I'm talking the 16th Amendment probably would not have happened. And the 17th probably would not have happened. And the other thing that's probably just has been as damaging, maybe even more damaging since then, is the bastardization by the Supreme Court of the 14th Amendment that began about 100 years ago, which began about 50 or 60 years after the 14th was passed. Of course, that's one of the Civil War amendments. But their bastardization of it and using it and saying, okay, this incorporates the Bill of Rights, and now we, the federal government, are going to decide your Bill of Rights. That has been one of the most destructive things that we've experienced, next to Lincoln's destruction of the original republic.
And that's what I think, is that all those evils that came later, Lincoln allowed that to happen. He set the stage that, plenty of evils occurred during the Civil War and Reconstruction, obviously, but it also allowed for all the evils that we face today and have further regarding the government, is because Lincoln won his war. And to get back to the tariff thing, I absolutely think the North went to war over the tariffs. Lincoln did, but I do think that doesn't necessarily mean the South left for tariffs, even though that was a major and leading cause, especially of the Cotton states.
Right.
I think you can say the North went to war over tariffs, but that was just one of the issues of which the Cotton states left the Union. I was reading Alan Gelzo. He's a Lincoln scholar, loves Lincoln, just had a great book, and he was talking about, even if slavery didn't occur at all, or slavery was unaffected by the Civil War, by Lincoln's presidency, he said Lincoln would still be considered the hinge president in American history because of what he did economically and centralizing power. That the changes he made were so drastic that he would be still that second revolution, the second American Revolution, as McPherson calls it, of America, because he transformed us irregardless of slavery. And that's what people don't recognize. All we know about Lincoln is that supposedly he saved the Union and freed the slaves, when really, he destroyed the Union, as you said. Yeah.
And everything
drastic transformation happened politically.
Yeah, everything we're experiencing today stems from that moment, from that time, from Lincoln's time. So not only did he destroy that republic just by making it one of force, but all the things that have happened since then are a direct result of it. If he hadn't done that, we wouldn't have, these other things would not have happened, in my opinion.
Right, because you'd have a check outside the federal government. If the federal government is the full authority, it's just going to continue to spiral and give itself more power. It doesn't actually, the checks and balances within the federal government are not enough, and they were never intended to be enough. The states, as Thomas Jefferson said, is the best check on the federal government. You need something outside that federal government to keep an eye on it and contest it, and to have authority that if the federal gets so far out of line, we're leaving or we're nullifying. That's how you manage the federal government. But now we have one government, and Thomas Jefferson said, because back then they had, every state was its own government. They didn't think of America as a nation.
Right.
We were a union of multiple governments. Right. The federal government was one government. He said, if we ever become consolidated into one government, as we are, and as Lincoln did, he said, you'll have to do a revolution, because your government's lost and it will become absolutely tyrannical. And that's what's happened when you centralize power throughout history. That's how it's been, which is why libertarians or the liberty movement has always been decentralization. That's the only way you can conserve liberty long term.
We have the government that the Anti-Federalists warned us about.
Hmm.
I would encourage everybody to go read everything the Anti-Federalists said, and the worst of the worst has come true.
And I'll say I've noticed a lot of similarities between the Confederate Constitution and the Articles of Confederation. In certain ways, they were moving back, I believe,
Yeah.
to the original Articles of Confederation, which many people saw the Constitution as simply an updated Articles of Confederation rather than a whole new government.
Right.
But definitely, you see the Southern Constitution a movement back towards the Articles of Confederation, definitely towards decentralization. They kind of, I would have loved to see it played out because they took everything the North did and the way they twisted the Constitution and they kind of corrected it to avoid those mistakes in the future.
Yep.
So as Lincoln set up all those bad things that happened, the Confederate Constitution put in place things to prevent that from happening. And I always imagine what sort of government the South would have been with those people over time, because you see the rest of the modern world go the way of Lincoln. Would the South have held out? For how long would they have held out?
Right.
You know, it's interesting to guess, I guess.
Yeah, and we can only guess on that one.
Yeah.
So, what do you hope that this book accomplishes? Because, by the way, I'm definitely going to read the whole thing, and you can get it. It's published through Shotwell Publishing. It's also on Amazon, correct?
Yeah, Amazon, and definitely check out shotwellpublishing.com. It is a great place to pick it up.
Okay. What are you hoping that this book accomplishes? Because it's, in my opinion, it's not just okay, here's another Civil War book. You know, it's not refighting. It's really pointing out some things that we're still dealing with the results of this because of what it did to our republic.
Which is why I say history is taught the way it is, so that we are compliant with what's going on today. And so that's why history matters and the Civil War matters today. It's not something that should be forgotten, because you can go back to the past and see the mistakes that we've made and how to reverse things, or how we can legally even take action at the local level. But as far as what I hope to accomplish, it's already accomplished far more than I ever thought it would. I was writing more for family, friends. I didn't think it'd reach a wide audience, and it's done far more than I could have ever imagined already. And, you know, joining with Shotwell Publishing, I think it's going to just expand even more over the coming months and year as reviews start pouring in, things like that. So
good.
I mean, I'm doing speaking engagements. I'm here with you. I would have never imagined this stuff, and so it's already gone beyond what I could have ever imagined. And so I can't ask for more, but I do feel more is coming, and hopefully I've had plenty of people email me, especially from the North, saying it's completely changed their politics.
Wow.
What they're doing, it's caused people to homeschool, you know, that weren't homeschooling. And it's just been great. I have a lot of advocates, I guess, that have read my book. I didn't spend $1 on marketing. It's all been word of mouth. And so the more people that get it, the better. I think open up some eyes for sure.
Well, that is great, and I hope it continues to do well. And you say that you do know some people that have already read this, and it's changed their whole view.
I've had people tell me it's changed their lives. It's changed their decisions. People have moved, they've homeschooled, they've changed the way they do their politics, and it's changed their whole mindset. I guess, like I said, if you can find out that something you were taught that you're so sure is true, presented as true, is actually false, then it opens up your mind to questioning other things.
Find out what else you've been lied to about. Yeah.
Right.
So, and I think we may have hit on some of this, but I got a few questions here if we could. Civil War myth that drives you crazy. What is the myth that drives you the craziest?
Oh, I don't know. There are so many. I'd really have to think about that. I would say it's probably associated with Lincoln, that Lincoln was desired equality. Or I guess I'd say that the North is these admirable, non-racist seekers of liberty, and that the South is a bunch of racist slave owners that didn't like blacks. And so I would say that portrayal, because that still exists today. It's still in Vermont. You still hear it, even in modern times, that those are the assumptions. You know, the South is backward, racist, you know, and the North is like this great place to be, when really we have our own forms of, we're very intolerant, I would say. of any views that go against us.
But, well, it doesn't help when you have people like Bill O'Reilly and Mark Levin and these others, and V.D. Hansen. Always, when it comes to the South, when it comes to the Civil War and the Confederacy, oh, well, they were just all a bunch of racists. Lincoln saved the country. Lincoln was one of the great Americans, one of the greatest presidents. And either these guys don't know any better, okay, that's possible, or they're just deliberately lying. And here's what really gets me is when they try to draw this link, they try to draw the link from the Democrats of the 1850s and 1860s, who were conservatives, who were the more truer American, generally speaking, in their outlook of how the government was supposed to function, more in line with the founders than were the Union, okay? And they try to make them sound like that they're actually a link to today's communist Democrats. No, I got news for you. The Republican Party of the 1850s and 1860s, who had more communist influence than there was in the South, those are the forerunners of today's progressive Democrats.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. No, that drives me nuts. And the thing is, I used to listen to guys like Bill O'Reilly, and now he's the example of what I despise. But I don't think it's ignorance. I really don't. I think they're using history as a political tool, and I think they're aware of it, that they're twisting it for their own party's benefit today, to try to make the Republican Party look good and try to make the modern Democrat Party look bad. But yeah, there's no connection between modern Democrats and the Democrats of 1860. No. And any person that knows anything about history is going to find that completely ridiculous. But the Republicans are taking advantage of an ignorant population, which most of America is. We go through government school. History is the subject we're most misled about, that we understand the least. And I think that's on purpose. And then you get people taking advantage of it, like David Barton, Bill O'Reilly, and those sorts, to try to peddle that kind of nonsense, I guess.
Yeah, the 48ers, the communists from Europe, they joined in mass in the Union ranks. They weren't in the Confederate ranks. So the Republican Party's history at that time frame is not a good history. It's not something to brag about. So people that try to draw straight lines from either of those parties to today's parties, they're just way off base. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. We were talking about the Republicans, and I think the only thing they have going for them today is that they're not as bad as the Democrats.
That's right.
And Kennedy's have a great book. I think it's Red Republicans, or Lincoln's Red Republicans, something along those lines. But the socialism, which I think the Republicans are a socialist party, they're just not as bad as the Democrats. Yeah. But all that goes back to 1860, where it infiltrated the Republican Party back then, and it's existed all along. And you have conservatives like the Democrats of the Old South attaching to the Republican Party today only because the other parties work.
The Democrats have gone so far left.
It's not because the Republican Party is somehow the founders' party and conservative the way it was back then. It's just that they're not as bad. And so they're hoping and trying to transform within the Republican Party. But I just don't think it's going to happen at the National Party, because those, I think, are the enemy. It's going to happen both the way.
Yeah, the national parties at the highest levels are basically two cheeks of the same dirty butt. And the other thing that you could say is that the Republican Party motto, like you say, they're better than the Democrats, because the Democrats are just full tilt crazy left wingers. Mm-hmm. But their real motto is, vote for us, we suck less. I mean, really, they're not a very, they talk a good game, but what do they do?
It's like Calhoun, like he said, all of a sudden you find these conservatives in the Republican Party when Obama's in control, when the Democrats are in control. And then once they're in control, they disappear because they want to pass the same progressive material for their friends. Right. And I mean, once you get into that swamp, it's done for. It's the wrong sort of people that we get at the federal level, which is why I love the Confederacy never had political parties. They get rid of that great evil. What I believe is the great evil is national political parties. Instead, you had actual local representatives for your local community who were supposed to then go represent the community at the national or the state level. And when you're not connected to a party and you're not funded that way, you can actually have that exist as the founding fathers
intended.
desired. 1824, I think I have the stats in my book. 1824 presidential election, 3.4% of people voted. Like it was supposed to be these aristocrat representatives of the local community, not a mass of people that can be manipulated by government education and by political parties in the money behind it. It's a whole different system that we have today that the United States should not be called
Oh, no.
far gone from 1860.
Most misunderstood Southern figure.
Southern figure?
Yeah, most misunderstood. Or maligned, I guess you could say. 'Cause,
I mean, I would say maybe Thomas Jefferson.
no, well, I'm thinking Southern figure from the Civil War era. Yeah,
Oh, I would say probably Nathan Bedford Forrest for
Yep.
sure.
Yep.
Um, that's got to be it, I think.
yeah.
And
And we've got our
in
show talks
general,
about
by
that
the way.
next Monday night. We're going to have a guy who actually works there at the home place, Gene Andrews. We've had him on the show before, and he's going to come on and talk some more about Nathan Bedford Forrest.
Right. Yeah, O'Reilly just, I didn't see it, but I know O'Reilly wrote a book or had a video, blasting Nathan Bedford Forrest, and I saw the Kennedys do some content on it. So that's a great time to set the record straight on Bedford Forrest for sure.
In addition to your book, one book everyone should read about the Civil War.
Ooh, there are so many great ones out there. I think DiLorenzo's The Real Lincoln is a great book for setting the record straight as far as the North goes. That's a great book. I have to say the South is right. I'm sorry, I didn't think about that first. The South is right by Walter and Don Kennedy.
Yep, that's an excellent book.
What I'd recommend as a starter.
Excellent book. So you can get the book on Amazon or Shotwell. And what's your next
Yep.
project?
Actually, I'm going to submit a book here to Shotwell in a month or so, and hopefully they'll be interested in that. But I'm basically taking the same sort of material from Dixie, but applying it to the military aspect. So I'm saying, Northern biases have influenced the way we look at the performance of generals such as Grant and Sherman, especially, are extremely overrated in their competence. And that McClellan, more than anyone, has been dismissed and degraded and was actually a much more proficient, better general. And had they took his ideas, it would have worked out much better for the North. And so it's in part because he ran against Lincoln. So that's why he's demonized in the North. I'm going to argue that Stonewall Jackson was the best general of the war. And then I'm going to look at some other military aspects of the war, such as the Gettysburg campaign, which I do not think was this huge, important war-changing battle that it's made out to be. I think
Really?
I think it was only a minor defeat for the South, and that they had plenty of fight and opportunity to win after that. And then, I think it's due to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address that they tried to blow that up in textbooks, because at the time it was not a big deal at all. He wasn't even the main speaker. Like, no one clapped. There's no reaction to it. Yet today it's the most studied speech in history, and it's because he used that speech to try to change people's mindset into a nation and a union. And so I think we've attached more importance to Gettysburg to elevate his address. And if you look at it from military aspects, Gettysburg was not this massive defeat for the South. It did not change the war. And so a few other military related subjects of interest to mine. So
That'll be interesting. Any closing thoughts?
I want to thank you for having me on. I hope that people search for truth. It's definitely not out there for everyone. One thing I've learned over time is it's almost not worth putting the effort. I used to debate and I loved it, and it was a lot of fun. But there's certain people that are just going to be resistant to truth no matter what. And always spread truth with whoever you can. But when, like as Jesus said, kick the dust up on your shoes and leave them behind. Go on to someone else who will listen and share information and truth with those who are ready to do it. And have fun doing it, I guess.
Well, hey, it's a great book. I'm glad you wrote it. I'm glad it's out there. Defending Dixie's Land, Amazon or Shotwell Publishing. Great book. A lot of good details in here, and it's not a huge book, but it's got a lot of good information. Hey, I really appreciate you coming on. I'm proud to have you on. Enjoyed it. Definitely have you back. We can talk some more about this book or your next book. I'd like to hear the more details on the book about the actual campaigns, the actual battles. That would be interesting.
Awesome. I will, if I could mention real quick, is definitely check out shotwellpublishing.com. They have, over 100 books. They're a pro self-publisher. They're great guys, and you can find books on any subject you could want related to Civil War, and definitely check out their catalog.
Okay. So are you, like I said, we consider you a damn good Yankee. How are the Yankees up there looking at you these days?
It's not a pretty sight up here, I would say. Even the conservatives are a different sort of conservatives. I'm only here because my kids are here. If I could convince them to go south, I definitely would. But yeah, I mean, there's people, they're open to stuff and you can convince them of things, but it's not really going to change their mindset. And
Right.
I don't want to say it's a lost cause up here. But people will be surprised, but they just don't. I don't know. It's not as important to them, I guess. Truth or history,
Right.
it seems overall to a lot of people up here as it is in other areas.
Right. Okay. Well,
They,
hey,
they just kind of go with the flow of, okay, that's then, whatever. It's how it is now, and there's nothing you can do about it.
yeah. Well,
They lack fire or motivation, I guess, in some ways.
the shooting has stopped, but
Right.
the results, we're still dealing with that every day.
Right.
Hey, thank you again. I appreciate you coming on. Glad to have you. Definitely love to have you back.
Awesome. I'd love to be back.
No second show for tonight. I want to thank the audience for taking time to watch our program. It doesn't cost anything to subscribe, so please be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons as well as the notification bell so you never miss an episode. We appreciate your support. Thanks again to Jonathan and Mary for their financial support for the month of July through November. We really appreciate it. Check out our audio podcast on iHeartRadio, Spotify, and other platforms as well. Sign up for our weekly newsletter at our website, teeninformer.com. Please find and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. On Tuesday, December 2nd, at the Jefferson County Library, David Seal will be hosting legislative training. This is important information that everyone should know so that you can effectively track legislation during this upcoming session. Our first guest next Monday, December 1st, will continue the focus on the War for Southern Independence. This is with Gene Andrews, who will be here to discuss how some major battles might have turned out differently if only the powers to be had listened to Nathan Bedford Forrest. We'll take a deep dive into answering difficult what-if questions. You don't want to miss that. And for our second show next Monday, beginning at 8:30 p.m., Don Gorham of the Gorham Homestead in Dixon joins us to tell us about their operations there and, believe it or not, government interference that she has experienced over the issue of raw milk. Yes, it seems that Tennessee actually has some milk Nazis. You definitely want to hear about that. It's important information. If you're in the 7th District, remember to vote in the special election. We've got a full-fledged communist running, a full-fledged Democratic communist running in Afton Bain. So hold your nose and vote for Van Epps. Got to keep the commie out of there. Hope you can join us next week. That's it for now. Good night from Paris, Tennessee, that is.